On Christmas Eve, a woman sold scarves for her grandson's medicine. My daughter-in-law whispered, "Just give her $5 and close the door." But I said, "It's freezing. Have dinner with us." My daughter-in-law was embarrassed. During dessert, the woman looked at her and said, "You don't recognize me, do you? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." I've lived in this old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania for 43 years, and I thought I knew everything worth knowing about hospitality, kindness, and the measure of a person's character. Christmas Eve of 2024 taught me I was wrong about all three, and about the woman who married my son. The snow had been falling steadily since morning, blanketing our property in that pristine silence that only comes in deep winter. Inside, the house smelled of roasting turkey and cinnamon, the same scents that had filled these rooms every Christmas since Gerald and I bought the place in 1981. Gerald passed 5 years ago, but I still set his place at the table. Old habits die hard, and some traditions deserve to outlive the people who started them. My son Jonathan and his wife Marilyn had arrived that afternoon with their 2 teenagers, Emma and Lucas. The kids immediately disappeared upstairs with their phones, as teenagers do. Marilyn had taken over my kitchen with the casual authority of someone who'd decided my methods were outdated. I let her. "Pick your battles," my mother used to say. "Mom, you really should update these countertops," Marilyn said, running her manicured finger along the vintage Formica. "This yellow is so 1980s. "That's when we installed them," I replied mildly, stirring the gravy. She laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Exactly my point. I'd learned over the 9 years of Jonathan's marriage that Marilyn measured worth in different currencies than I did. Square footage, brand names, the kind of car you drove. She'd tried to convince Jonathan to put me in a retirement community 3 times now, insisting this old farmhouse was too much for a woman my age. What she meant was that the property, 20 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland, was too valuable to leave in the hands of someone who grew tomatoes instead of condominiums. The doorbell rang at 6:15, just as I was setting out the good china. "I'll get it," I called, wiping my hands on my apron. "Mom, we're not expecting anyone," Jonathan said, looking up from his phone. "Probably just carolers." But when I opened the heavy oak door, letting in a gust of frigid air and swirling snow, I found an elderly woman on my porch. She looked about my age, maybe older, her thin frame wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing that spoke of hard times. In her arms, she carried a wicker basket filled with hand-knitted scarves in various colors. "Please," she said, her voice trembling from cold or emotion or both. "I'm selling these scarves. I need money for my grandson's medicine. He's very sick." Her eyes were a striking pale blue, made more vivid by the cold. There was something in her face, a quiet desperation that went beyond the immediate request. Behind me, I heard Marilyn's footsteps clicking across the hardwood floor. "Just give her $5 and close the door, Mother Ruth," Marilyn whispered sharply in my ear. "It's freezing, and dinner's getting cold." I felt something harden in my chest. Maybe it was the way Marilyn had reduced a human being to an inconvenience. Maybe it was the way she called me Mother Ruth, only when she wanted to sound respectful while being anything but. Or maybe it was simply that I'd seen too much of the world to believe that closing doors on people in need was ever the right answer. "Come inside," I said to the woman, stepping back and opening the door wide. "It's freezing out there. Have some dinner with us." "Mom!" Marilyn's voice held genuine shock. The elderly woman's eyes widened. "Oh, I couldn't possibly—" "I insist," I said firmly. "No one should be alone on Christmas Eve, and no one should be selling scarves in a snowstorm. Come in, warm up, have a proper meal. We have more than enough." Marilyn's face had gone rigid with mortification. Jonathan appeared behind her, looking uncertain. He'd inherited his father's kind heart, but had somehow lost the backbone that should have come with it. "Ruth, we don't know this person," Marilyn said, her voice low and tense. "Neither did the innkeeper in Bethlehem," I replied, taking the woman's basket and setting it on the hall bench. "And since we're celebrating that particular story tonight, it seems fitting." The woman stepped inside hesitantly, snow melting from her worn boots onto the doormat. Up close, I could see she'd once been beautiful. Good bones, as my mother would have said. The kind of face that age refines rather than ruins. My name is Ruth Whitman, I said, helping her out of her damp coat. This is my son Jonathan, his wife Marilyn, and somewhere upstairs are my grandchildren Emma and Lucas. Deborah, the woman said softly. Deborah Sullivan. Thank you. You're very kind. Marilyn made a small, strangled noise and retreated to the kitchen. I could hear her yanking cabinet doors open and slamming them closed. Jonathan gave me a helpless look and followed his wife. I settled Deborah in Gerald's chair. It felt right somehow, and brought her a cup of hot tea while I finished preparing dinner. She sat quietly, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the room. The photos on the mantel, the ancient piano in the corner, the cross-stitch sampler my grandmother had made in 1932 that read, "Bless this house." Emma and Lucas came down when I called, their faces showing typical teenage suspicion of anything that disrupted their digital worlds. Marilyn emerged from the kitchen with a smile so forced it looked like it physically pained her. We sat down to eat. The meal was awkward at first. Marilyn made pointed small talk, the kind designed to remind everyone that this was an unusual situation. Jonathan tried to compensate with forced cheerfulness. The kids picked at their food, but Deborah ate slowly, methodically, like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in some time. It broke my heart and strengthened my resolve. "So, Deborah," Marilyn said as I served the pumpkin pie. Her voice had that razor edge of false sweetness. "Where exactly do you live?" "Here and there," Deborah said quietly. "I lost my apartment 6 months ago. I've been staying at the Grace Street shelter when they have room." Marilyn's expression suggested this confirmed every worst suspicion she'd harbored. Emma looked uncomfortable. Lucas, I noticed, had put down his phone and was actually listening. "Your grandson," I said gently. "You mentioned he needed medicine?" Deborah's eyes filled with tears. "Yes. He's 11, leukemia. The treatment is—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "That's terrible," Jonathan said, his voice full of genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry." "These things happen," Deborah said, and there was something in her tone, a weight of knowledge, of experience with tragedy, that made me study her more closely. We finished dessert in relative silence. Marilyn had stopped trying to make conversation and was radiating disapproval like a space heater. I poured coffee and was about to suggest we move to the living room when Deborah set down her cup and looked directly at Marilyn. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Deborah said. The room seemed to contract around those words. Marilyn froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "I'm sorry?" Marilyn said, but her voice had gone thin. Deborah's pale blue eyes never wavered. "I'm the grandmother of the boy you hit with your car 10 years ago and left to die." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of a winter evening, but the terrible stillness before an avalanche. I watched Marilyn's face drain of all color. Jonathan's fork clattered against his plate. Emma gasped. That's insane," Marilyn whispered. "Jonathan, she's insane. Call someone." But Jonathan wasn't moving. He was staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, a kind of dawning horror. "Mrs. Whitman," Deborah said, turning to me with those devastating blue eyes, "did your daughter-in-law ever tell you about the accident she had in December 2014? The one in Philadelphia, near the university?" My hands had gone numb. "No," I said slowly. "No, she didn't. There was no accident." Marilyn stood up so quickly her chair fell backward. "This woman is clearly mentally ill. She's probably been planning this, targeting us somehow." "His name was Thomas," Deborah continued, her voice steady now, gaining strength. "Thomas Sullivan. He was 8 years old. He was crossing the street to get to his music lesson when a black Mercedes hit him and drove away. The police never found the driver." She paused. "Until tonight, I never knew who killed my grandson." The word "killed" hung in the air like smoke. "Get out," Marilyn said, her voice shaking. "Get out of this house right now, or I'm calling the police." "Yes," Deborah said quietly. "Let's call the police. I think they'd be very interested in this conversation." I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Marilyn's reaction wasn't that of an innocent person wrongly accused. It was the reaction of someone cornered. And suddenly, 100 small things from the past 10 years clicked into place. Marilyn's insistence on trading in her Mercedes the year after she and Jonathan married. Her nervousness around police. The way she'd pushed Jonathan to move from Philadelphia to this rural area with such urgency. Her drinking problem that had mysteriously started around 2014 and lasted 3 years. "Jonathan," I said carefully, "did you know about this?" My son's face was ashen. There was an accident, but Marilyn said she'd hit a mailbox. She said, "I hit a mailbox!" Marilyn shrieked. "That's all it was. This woman is lying." "Then you won't mind if I call Detective Fuller," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. Roger Fuller had been our neighbor for 15 years, a state police detective who'd helped us when vandals hit the property 3 years back. He can sort this out. "No." Marilyn lunged for my phone, but Jonathan caught her arm. "Marilyn," he said, his voice breaking, "please tell me this isn't true." "It was an accident," she whispered. I didn't see him. It was snowing, and I was late for a meeting, and I panicked. "Jonathan, please, you have to believe me." The confession hung in the room like a noose. Deborah stood up slowly with immense dignity. From her pocket, she withdrew a small digital recorder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's all I needed." My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. "You planned this." "For 10 years," Deborah confirmed. "It took me 10 years to find her." The police closed the case, said there wasn't enough evidence even though I had a partial plate number, but I never stopped looking. She turned to Marilyn. "You took my grandson from me. You took my daughter's only child. You destroyed our family and drove away like he was nothing." "I'm sorry," Marilyn sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." "You knew exactly what to do," Deborah said coldly. "You chose to protect yourself instead of calling for help. Thomas died alone in the street in the snow. He was 8 years old, and he died alone because you were too much of a coward to face what you'd done." I sank back into my chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. This woman, this stranger I'd invited into my home out of simple kindness, had been carrying this weight, this mission for a decade, and I'd opened the door to her prey. "Mom," Jonathan said, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." I believed him. But I was also realizing, with growing dread, that the quiet Christmas Eve I'd planned had just become ground zero for something much larger and darker than I could have imagined. And I was also wondering, how had Deborah known to come to my door tonight? How had she known Marilyn would be here? What else did she know about our family? The questions piled up in my mind like the snow outside, each one heavier than the last. Deborah picked up her basket of scarves with trembling hands. "I'll be going now. The police will want to hear this recording." "Wait," I said, my voice hoarse. "How did you find us? How did you know to come here tonight?" Deborah smiled, and it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. "That's a longer story, Mrs. Whitman. One that involves more than just an accident on a snowy street 10 years ago." She walked to the door, and I found myself following her, my mind spinning with implications I couldn't yet fully grasp. "Deborah," I said as she pulled on her coat. "What do you mean, a longer story?" She looked at me with those pale blue eyes, and I saw something in them that made my blood run cold. "Ask your daughter-in-law about the insurance policy," she said quietly. "The one she took out on Thomas's mother 2 months before the accident. Ask her why Thomas and my daughter were in Philadelphia that day in the first place." She paused at the threshold. "Ask her who really benefited when my daughter died of a broken heart 6 months after her son was killed." Then she was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow, leaving me standing in the doorway with questions multiplying like frost on glass. Behind me, I heard Marilyn start to scream. I closed the door against the winter cold, but I couldn't shut out what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I turned back to face my family. Marilyn had collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands, shoulders heaving with sobs that sounded more like panic than remorse. Jonathan stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face a mask of shock and confusion. Emma and Lucas huddled together on the stairs, their teenage bravado completely stripped away. "Everyone sit down," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. We need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. Marilyn's head snapped up, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with mascara. That woman is delusional. She's been stalking us, planning this whole thing. You confessed. I interrupted quietly. We all heard you. You said it was an accident, that you panicked. I was confused. She manipulated me, caught me off guard. Mom. Jonathan's voice was hollow. What did she mean about an insurance policy? Marilyn's eyes went wide, and I saw real fear there. I don't know what she's talking about. The woman is clearly disturbed. Stop lying! Jonathan's shout made everyone jump. I'd never heard my son raise his voice like that, not in all his 42 years. Just stop, please. I moved to the antique secretary desk in the corner where I kept important papers. I'm going to call Detective Fuller. This needs to be handled properly. No! Marilyn lunged toward me, but Jonathan stepped between us. Marilyn, if you're innocent, the police can help prove that, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You don't understand, she whispered. If this gets out, everything we've built, Jonathan's career, the children's futures, it'll all be destroyed. Maybe it should be, Emma said from the stairs. Her young voice cut through the room. If you killed someone, Mom, if you actually killed a little kid and just drove away. I didn't kill anyone. Marilyn's voice rose to a shriek. It was an accident, and I don't even know if I actually hit him. Maybe someone else did and I just drove past. You said you panicked, Lucas pointed out quietly. Why would you panic if you didn't know you hit him? I watched my grandson's face, seeing a maturity there I hadn't noticed before. This night was aging all of us in terrible ways. Before I could reach for the phone, it rang. The old landline that I kept despite Marilyn's insistence that it was obsolete. I picked up, still watching Marilyn. Ruth? It's Roger Fuller. My stomach dropped. Roger, I was just about to call you. I figured you might be. I'm at the station with a Deborah Sullivan. She just played me a very interesting recording. His voice was professional, careful. I'm going to need to talk to Marilyn. Tonight. I looked at my daughter-in-law who had gone pale as snow. She's here. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Ruth, don't let her leave. And don't discuss this any further until I arrive. The line went dead. I set down the phone and turned to find Marilyn already on her feet, grabbing her coat from the hall closet. I need some air, she said, her voice high and tight. No, I said firmly. Detective Fuller is on his way. You need to wait. You can't keep me here. I'm not under arrest. Not yet, Jonathan said quietly. He was looking at his wife like he'd never seen her before. But if you run, you will be. Marilyn's hands were shaking as she clutched her coat. Jonathan, please. You have to believe me. That woman, Deborah, there's something wrong with her. The things she said about insurance, about her daughter, it's all lies meant to confuse everyone. Then we'll sort it out when the detective gets here, I said, moving to stand between Marilyn and the door. At 68, I wasn't as spry as I once was, but I was still substantial enough to be an obstacle. Get out of my way, old woman, Marilyn hissed, and there it was, the contempt she'd always hidden behind false smiles and fake concern. Mom, don't, Jonathan said, reaching for his wife's arm. She jerked away from him. Don't touch me. None of you understand what it was like. I was building my career. I had everything to lose. A child died, I said, my voice hard. An 8-year-old boy died, and you're talking about your career. The slap came so fast I barely saw it coming. Marilyn's hand cracked across my face with enough force to snap my head to the side. I heard Emma scream, heard Jonathan shout, but I stayed on my feet. I'd been through worse than a slap from a panicked woman. You self-righteous witch, Marilyn spat. You've always looked down on me, always acted like I wasn't good enough for your precious son. Well, at least I didn't waste my life in this decaying museum, pretending that kindness and charity make you better than everyone else. Jonathan grabbed Marilyn's arm, pulling her back. That's enough. Go upstairs. Now. For a moment, I thought she might hit him too, but something in Jonathan's face, a hardness I'd never seen there before, made her deflate. She turned and ran up the stairs, her footsteps thundering overhead before a door slammed. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the wind howling outside. "Grandma, are you okay?" Emma rushed to my side, her young face full of concern. "I'm fine, sweetheart." My cheek throbbed, but I'd had worse. Just shocked, that's all. Jonathan sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Mom, I swear to you, I didn't know about any of this." I believed him, but a terrible thought was forming in my mind. "Jonathan, when did you and Marilyn get married?" "June 2015. "Why? And when did you start dating?" He looked up, confusion clouding his features. "January 2015. We met at a conference in Philadelphia." "What are you thinking?" I was thinking that the timeline was damning. The accident in December 2014, Marilyn meeting Jonathan 1 month later, their whirlwind courtship and quick marriage, her insistence on moving away from Philadelphia, the insurance policy Deborah had mentioned. "I need to look something up," I said, moving to my laptop on the desk. My hands were steadier now, purpose overriding shock. "What are you looking for?" Lucas asked. "Deborah mentioned Marilyn's daughter dying 6 months after Thomas. That would be June 2015. I typed quickly, searching for obituaries, news articles, anything that might connect the dots. "Deborah's daughter is dead?" Jonathan's voice cracked. "That woman lost both her grandson and her daughter?" "Apparently." I scrolled through search results, my reading glasses perched on my nose. Here, Diane Sullivan, died June 3, 2015, at age 34. Cause of death listed as heart failure, but... Wait. What? Emma leaned over my shoulder. There was an investigation. Brief mention in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I clicked the link, my heart pounding. Diane Sullivan's death was initially ruled suspicious due to the presence of... Oh no. What does it say? Jonathan was on his feet now. High levels of prescription medication in her system. But the investigation was dropped when her doctor confirmed she'd been prescribed antidepressants and sleeping pills following her son's death. Accidental overdose. I looked up at Jonathan. Who was her doctor? Jonathan's face had gone gray. I don't know, but Marilyn used to work in pharmaceutical sales. She had access to... Oh God. That doesn't mean anything, I said quickly, though my mind was racing ahead, making connections I desperately didn't want to make. Lots of people work in pharmaceutical sales. She worked for Hanson Medical, Jonathan said slowly, in Philadelphia. She left that job right before we got married, said she wanted a fresh start. I typed in the search terms, my fingers clumsy with dread. Hanson Medical, Diane Sullivan. The results loaded slowly, but when they did, I felt my blood turn to ice. "Jonathan," I said carefully, "did Marilyn ever mention knowing anyone named Diane Sullivan?" "No, never." "Why?" I turned the laptop so he could see the screen. It was a photo from a Hanson Medical Company retreat in 2013. In the front row, smiling at the camera, were two women with their arms around each other. One was younger Marilyn, her hair lighter, her face unlined by stress and secrets. The other was a pretty brunette with kind eyes. The caption read, "Marilyn Winters and Diane Sullivan, top sales representatives, at the annual Hanson Medical Retreat, Lake Tahoe, 2013. They knew each other," Emma whispered. "They worked together." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Marilyn and Diane, colleagues. Thomas, Diane's son. The accident in December 2014. Diane's death 6 months later. The insurance policy Deborah had mentioned. Marilyn meeting Jonathan 1 month after the accident. Far too convenient to be coincidence. "There's more," Lucas said, pointing at the screen. He'd pulled up another article on his phone. "Look at this. Diane Sullivan had a life insurance policy worth $500,000. The beneficiary was changed 3 months before she died." "Changed to whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Marilyn Winters. Reason given, longtime friend and designated caretaker for Thomas Sullivan in the event of Diane's death." The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, each note like a hammer blow. Outside, I heard the crunch of tires on snow. Detective Fuller had arrived. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my mind reeling with implications. Deborah hadn't just come here for justice about Thomas's death. She'd come because she believed Marilyn had murdered her daughter too. And suddenly, I wasn't sure she was wrong. "Jonathan," I said quietly, "go get Marilyn. The detective is here." He nodded mutely and headed for the stairs. Emma and Lucas stood close together, looking younger and more vulnerable than they had an hour ago. I went to answer the door. Detective Fuller stood on my porch, his coat dusted with snow, his expression grave. Behind him was Deborah Sullivan, her pale blue eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me shiver. "Ruth," Fuller said, "we need to talk. All of us." "I know," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "I think we're starting to understand just how deep this goes." Deborah's gaze moved past me to the stairs where Jonathan was descending with a defiant Marilyn. "Not nearly deep enough," she said softly. "You don't know the half of it yet." And I realized with a sinking certainty that this Christmas Eve had only begun to unravel its terrible secrets. Detective Fuller removed his coat with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd entered too many homes bearing bad news. Deborah stood behind him like a ghost from Christmas past, her presence filling my warm farmhouse with the chill of unfinished business. Marilyn descended the stairs with her chin raised, defiance radiating from every carefully composed line of her body. She'd reapplied her makeup and changed into a crisp white blouse, as if the armor of respectability could protect her from what was coming. "Mrs. Whitman," Fuller said, nodding to Marilyn, "thank you for waiting. I'd like to ask you some questions about an incident in December 2014. "I want a lawyer," Marilyn said immediately. Fuller's expression didn't change. "That's your right. But I should tell you, we're not here to arrest you. Not yet. This is just a conversation." "Nothing about this is just anything," Marilyn shot back. "That woman," she pointed at Deborah, "has orchestrated some kind of elaborate revenge scheme. She ambushed me in my mother-in-law's home on Christmas Eve, recorded a private conversation without consent." "Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state," Deborah interrupted quietly. "I had every legal right to record our conversation." Marilyn's jaw tightened. "She's been stalking my family. I've been investigating my grandson's murder," Deborah corrected. "There's a difference." "It was an accident." Marilyn's voice rose. "How many times do I have to say it?" "Then let's talk about that accident," Fuller said, pulling out a notebook. "December 18th, 2014. Around 3:30 in the afternoon. Corner of Walnut and 42nd Street in Philadelphia. A black Mercedes sedan struck an 8-year-old boy and fled the scene. The child, Thomas Sullivan, died 40 minutes later at Presbyterian Hospital. The clinical recitation of facts seemed to drain some of Marilyn's bravado. Jonathan stood at the base of the stairs, his face ashen. Emma and Lucas watched from the living room doorway, witnesses to their family's disintegration. "I don't remember the exact date," Marilyn said carefully. "But yes, I had an accident around that time. I thought I'd hit a mailbox. There was snow, poor visibility." "The mailbox story," Deborah said, her voice heavy with disgust. "You told that to the body shop too, didn't you? When you had your Mercedes repaired 2 days later at Precision Auto on Lancaster Avenue." Marilyn's eyes widened fractionally. "How did you—" "I told you. I've been investigating. For 10 years. Deborah pulled a folder from her large purse, the same bag that had held the scarves. "I have the repair invoice. Front bumper damage, cracked headlight, paint transfer consistent with impact. The shop owner remembered you because you paid cash. $3,200 in cash, so there'd be no insurance claim, no paper trail." Fuller took the folder, examining the documents inside. His expression grew darker with each page. "I was embarrassed," Marilyn said quickly. "I didn't want it on my insurance record. That doesn't prove anything." "It proves you lied," Jonathan said quietly. His voice was flat, emotionless. "You told me you hit a mailbox, but you paid thousands in cash to avoid documentation. People don't do that unless they're hiding something." "I was hiding my own stupidity," Marilyn whirled on him. "I was hiding the fact that I'd been on my phone, not paying attention." "You were on your phone." Fuller's pen moved across his notebook. "That wasn't in your original statement." Marilyn froze, realizing her mistake. "I didn't make an original statement because I didn't know I'd hit anyone." But you just said you weren't paying attention, Emma pointed out from the doorway. So you knew you might have hit something, but you didn't stop to check. My granddaughter's logic was devastating in its simplicity. Marilyn opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. I'm not discussing this without a lawyer present. Fair enough, Fuller said. But before we get lawyers involved, let me tell you what else Mrs. Sullivan has uncovered. Because it goes well beyond a hit-and-run accident. He opened another folder that Deborah handed him. Diane Sullivan, age 34, died June 3, 2015, of what was ruled an accidental overdose of prescription medications. She was Thomas's mother, and she'd been severely depressed following her son's death. He looked up at Marilyn. She was also your co-worker and close friend at Hanson Medical. We worked together, Marilyn admitted. That's not a crime. No, but taking out a life insurance policy on a friend and then becoming the beneficiary of her existing policy might raise some questions, Fuller continued, especially when that friend dies 6 months after losing her child in an accident you were involved in. The room had gone deathly quiet. I sank into my chair, my mind struggling to process what was being suggested. You're saying I killed Diane? Marilyn's laugh was shrill. That's insane. She was depressed. She was on medication. Medication you had access to, Deborah said. Her voice was steady now, growing stronger. You worked for the same pharmaceutical company. You had access to samples, to prescription pads that doctors left lying around in their offices. Diane's doctor was on Hanson Medical's client list. You visited his office twice a month. So did 20 other sales reps. But only one of them had a reason to want Diane dead, Deborah continued. Only one of them had killed Diane's son and needed to make sure no one ever found out. That's speculation. Marilyn was backing toward the door now. You have no proof of any of this. Actually, Fuller said slowly, we might. When Deborah brought me this information tonight, I made some calls. The detective who originally investigated Diane Sullivan's death is retired now, but he kept his case files. He always thought there was something off about that death. He pulled out another document. Diane Sullivan changed her will 3 months before she died, making Marilyn Winters the beneficiary of her life insurance policy and the guardian of Thomas Sullivan should anything happen to her. The reason stated was that Marilyn had volunteered to care for Thomas if needed, and that Diane wanted to ensure her son would be looked after by someone she trusted. I was trying to help, Marilyn whispered. Diane was falling apart after Thomas died. She asked me to be there for her son? Thomas was already dead when you became the beneficiary, I said, the pieces finally clicking together. Diane changed her will in March 2015. Thomas died in December 2014. The math was damning. Marilyn's face crumpled. She was going to tell, Marilyn said suddenly, her voice breaking. Diane was going to tell the police about the accident. She'd figured it out somehow, realized it was my car, my Mercedes. She called me in May, said she had proof, said she was going to the police unless I confessed myself. Jonathan made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. So, you killed her, Deborah said. It wasn't a question. No. I tried to talk to her, tried to explain it was an accident. But she wouldn't listen. She was hysterical, threatening me, saying I'd destroyed her life. Marilyn was crying now, makeup running again. I went to her apartment to reason with her. She'd been drinking, mixing her medication with alcohol. I gave her a few more pills, just to calm her down. I didn't mean for her to die. I just needed time to think, to figure out what to do. The confession hung in the air like poison gas. Fuller was writing rapidly. Emma had started crying. Lucas looked like he might be sick. You murdered my daughter, Deborah said, and her voice could have frozen fire. You killed my grandson, and then you murdered my daughter to cover it up. It wasn't like that, Marilyn sobbed. Everything just spiraled out of control. The accident with Thomas was genuine. I panicked. But then Diane started investigating, and I couldn't let her destroy everything I'd worked for. Everything you'd worked for? Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper. Marilyn, you killed a child and a woman. You killed them both. I'm sorry. Marilyn reached for him, but he recoiled. Jonathan, please. I never meant for any of this to happen. And then I met you, and you were so kind. so stable, and I thought maybe this was my chance to start over, to be better. You used me, Jonathan said hollowly. You met me 1 month after killing Thomas. You married me to establish a new life, a new identity. Moving out here, away from Philadelphia, insisting we use your maiden name Winters instead of your married name? You were married before? Fuller looked up sharply. Marilyn closed her eyes. Divorced. My ex-husband's name was Hansen. Brian Hansen. My blood ran cold. Hansen, as in Hansen Medical. His father owned the company, Deborah said. I found that out too. Marilyn married the boss's son, got access to everything. Then when the marriage fell apart, she kept working there, kept all her connections, including access to her ex-father-in-law's prescription pad. It was Fuller's turn to look shocked. Dr. Brian Hansen Sr. was Diane Sullivan's physician, and he never questioned why his former daughter-in-law needed samples, Deborah finished, because she'd maintained a friendly relationship with the family after the divorce. She was careful, methodical, but she made one mistake. What mistake? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Deborah reached into her folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed 2 women at a restaurant, laughing over wine glasses. One was Diane Sullivan. The other was Marilyn, but her appearance was different. Darker hair, heavier makeup. This was taken 2 weeks before Diane died, Deborah said, by a friend of Diane's who was at the same restaurant. She posted it on social media, tagged Diane but not Marilyn because she didn't know who Marilyn was. I found it 3 years ago, spent the next 7 years tracking down Marilyn Winters. She pulled out another photo. This is from the security camera outside Diane's apartment building the night she died. You can see a woman matching Marilyn's description entering at 9:47 p.m. Diane was found dead the next morning. Fuller took the photos, his expression grim. Mrs. Whitman, I'm going to need you to come to the station. We have a lot more to discuss. I want my lawyer, Marilyn repeated, but her voice was defeated now. You'll get one, Fuller said, standing. Ruth, I'm sorry this happened in your home on Christmas Eve. But I was looking at Deborah, seeing her in a new light. You planned all of this, coming here tonight, the recording, having all this evidence ready. I've been planning it for 10 years, Deborah confirmed. I knew Marilyn would be here for Christmas. I've been watching your family for months, Mrs. Whitman. I know your routines, your schedules. I knew that you were kind, that you'd invite me in if I appeared on your doorstep in need. I counted on your compassion. You used me, I said, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. I used your kindness to expose a killer, Deborah corrected, and I'm not sorry for that, but I am sorry you had to be involved. Grandma didn't do anything wrong, Emma said fiercely. She was just being herself. Marilyn is the one who's wrong. Fuller was putting handcuffs on Marilyn, reading her rights. Jonathan stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. The scene felt surreal, like something from a television show rather than my peaceful farmhouse on Christmas Eve. There's one more thing, Deborah said quietly, looking at me. Something you should know before this all goes further. My heart sank. What now? Marilyn didn't just take out life insurance on Diane, Deborah said. According to records I found, she also took out a policy on you, Mrs. Whitman, 2 years ago. $500,000, with Marilyn listed as beneficiary. She told the insurance company she was your daughter-in-law and you'd requested it. The room spun. Jonathan's face went from gray to white. Mom? He whispered. Did you ask Marilyn to take out life insurance on you? Of course not, I said, but my voice sounded far away. I have my own life insurance through the Farm Bureau. Deborah's pale blue eyes held mine. Then you should ask yourself why your daughter-in-law would take out a secret policy on your life, and what she might have been planning to do about this property you're sitting on. The 20 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland. The property Marilyn had been pressuring me to sell. The retirement community she kept suggesting. The updated will she'd convinced Jonathan to encourage me to write. I'd invited a stranger into my home tonight, seeking to do a kindness. But that stranger had just saved my life. The state police station in Lancaster was a modern, sterile building that seemed designed to strip away pretense and comfort. I sat in a small conference room with beige walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. a cup of terrible coffee growing cold in my hands. It was nearly midnight on Christmas Eve, and my entire world had tilted on its axis. Detective Fuller sat across from me, joined now by a younger detective named Michelle Cooper, who specialized in financial crimes. Jonathan was in another room, giving his statement. Marilyn had been processed and was waiting for her lawyer in a holding cell. Emma and Lucas had gone home with Fuller's wife, who'd arrived an hour ago to take them somewhere away from all this. Deborah Sullivan sat beside me, no longer the desperate scarf seller, but a woman transformed by purpose and vindication. In the station's unforgiving light, I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the gray streaked through her hair, the weight of her loss etched into every feature. "Mrs. Whitman," Detective Cooper said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "I need you to look at these very carefully and tell me if you recognize any of these signatures." I pulled my reading glasses from my purse and examined the papers. They were insurance documents, bank statements, legal forms. My signature appeared on several of them, but something was wrong. "These aren't mine," I said slowly, comparing the signatures to my driver's license. "They're similar, but look at the W in Whitman. My W always has a little flourish at the top. These don't." "That's what our handwriting analyst thought too," Cooper said. "Marilyn forged your signature on multiple documents over the past 2 years. Life insurance policies, power of attorney forms, even a quitclaim deed transferring ownership of your property to a trust she controlled." The words didn't make sense at first. "But that's impossible. The farm is in my name. I never signed anything like that. The deed was never filed," Fuller explained. "We think Marilyn was waiting for the right moment. Probably after—" He paused delicately. "After I was dead," I finished quietly. The coffee cup trembled in my hands. Deborah reached over and steadied it. Her touch was surprisingly gentle for a woman who'd spent a decade hunting a killer. "There's more," Cooper continued. "We've been going through Marilyn's financial records since she was arrested. She's in serious debt. Over $200,000 in credit card bills, a second mortgage on your son's house that Jonathan apparently didn't know about, and several high-interest loans from questionable sources." "Jonathan doesn't know?" I asked, stunned. "He didn't sign for any of it. More forgeries." Fuller's expression was grim. "She's been living well beyond their means for years, hiding it from your son. The life insurance policies on you and Diane Sullivan weren't just about covering up crimes. Marilyn needed the money. I thought of all the expensive clothes Marilyn wore, the luxury SUV she drove, the private schools she'd insisted on for Emma and Lucas. Jonathan made a good living as an architect, but not that good. I'd wondered sometimes how they afforded their lifestyle, but I'd assumed they were simply better at managing money than I was. How much did she stand to gain from my death?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Between the policies she took out and being named as beneficiary in various documents she created, approximately $800,000, Cooper said. "Plus your property, which is worth at least another $1 million. The room tilted. Deborah's hand on my arm was the only thing keeping me grounded. "She was going to kill me," I whispered. "Like she killed Diane." "We believe so, yes," Fuller said. "We found searches on her laptop from 3 weeks ago. Elderly falls statistics, natural causes of death over 65, medication interactions in seniors." She was researching methods. My mind flashed back over the past few months. Marilyn's sudden interest in my health, her insistence that I start taking vitamins she'd bought me. The bottle of supplements was still in my medicine cabinet at home, unopened because something about Marilyn's pushiness had made me suspicious. "I have vitamins," I said suddenly. "Marilyn gave them to me 2 months ago. Special ones," she said, "for bone health and energy. I never took them." Cooper and Fuller exchanged glances. "We'll need to retrieve those," Cooper said, making a note. "If they're tampered with, it would be more evidence." "How did this happen?" I asked, looking at Deborah. "How did you figure all of this out?" Deborah's smile was sad and tired. "I didn't figure out the part about you until recently. I was focused on finding who killed Thomas and Diane. But 3 months ago I was following Marilyn. I'd narrowed down my search to her by then, and I saw her meeting with a life insurance agent. I got curious, did some digging. That's when I found the policy on you. And you decided to warn me by showing up on Christmas Eve?" There was no accusation in my voice, only curiosity. I decided to force Marilyn into a confession by showing up on Christmas Eve, Deborah corrected. I knew she'd be off balance, surrounded by family, unable to control the situation. I knew you'd invite me in because I'd watched you enough to understand your character, and I knew that once I confronted her about Thomas, everything else would start to unravel. You took a terrible risk, I said. What if I hadn't invited you in? Then I had backup plans, but I was fairly certain you would. You have a reputation in your community, Mrs. Whitman. Everyone knows Ruth Whitman doesn't turn away people in need. Deborah's expression softened. My daughter was like you. Kind, generous to a fault. It's why Marilyn was able to get close to her, to manipulate her. The door opened, and a uniformed officer entered, handing Fuller a folder. The detective scanned it quickly, his jaw tightening. Marilyn's lawyer has arrived. Marcus Hendricks from Philadelphia. Apparently she's had him on retainer for years. Why would she need a lawyer on retainer? I asked. That's an excellent question, Cooper said. Hendricks usually represents corporate executives and wealthy individuals involved in white-collar crimes. He doesn't come cheap. Fuller stood. Mrs. Whitman, I need to ask you something difficult. Is there any way Marilyn could have harmed you over the past few months? Any illnesses, dizzy spells, anything unusual? I thought back carefully. I had a bout of food poisoning 6 weeks ago. Marilyn had brought dinner over, insisted I eat it while it was hot. I was sick for 3 days afterward. Did you see a doctor? No, I thought it was just a stomach bug. Cooper made another note. Any other incidents? There was a problem with my car brakes last month, I said slowly, the memory taking on sinister new dimensions. The mechanic said the brake line had corroded, which was odd because the car was only 3 years old and well-maintained. Marilyn had borrowed my car the week before, said hers was in the shop. Fuller's expression darkened. We'll want to talk to that mechanic. What else? Nothing specific, but I hesitated. Marilyn started visiting me more often these past few months. She'd drop by unannounced, always with some excuse. She'd insist on making me tea, bringing me meals. At the time, I thought she was finally making an effort to be close to me. Now I wonder if she was testing methods. Testing methods to kill you without raising suspicion, Deborah said bluntly. That's exactly what she did with Diane. She visited more frequently in the weeks before Diane died, always bringing food or drinks, gradually increasing Diane's dependence on the medication until the final night when she gave her the overdose. I felt sick. How long have you known all of this? I've been piecing it together for years, Deborah said, but I only had proof about Thomas. Everything else was circumstantial until tonight. I needed Marilyn to confess, to incriminate herself. That's why I set up tonight's confrontation. The door opened again. This time it was Jonathan, his face haggard and aged beyond his 42 years. He looked at me with eyes full of anguish. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have seen what she was. I should have protected you. I stood and pulled my son into my arms. You didn't know. How could you? I should have questioned things more. The money, her obsession with your property, the way she pushed you to change your will. His voice broke. She was going to kill you, and I brought her into your life. No, I said firmly. She brought herself into your life. She targeted you deliberately, Jonathan. You were a means to an end. Fuller cleared his throat. Mr. Whitman, we need to ask you about your financial situation. Were you aware your wife had taken out a second mortgage on your home? Jonathan pulled back, wiping his eyes. What? No, that's impossible. She forged your signature, Cooper explained. Just like she forged your mother's. We're still uncovering the extent of the fraud, but it appears Marilyn has been running various schemes for years. Why? Jonathan asked desperately. We had enough money. We were comfortable. Comfortable wasn't enough for Marilyn, Deborah said quietly. I've learned a lot about her over these years. She grew up poor, married into wealth with the Hanson family, then lost it all in the divorce. She spent the rest of her life trying to claw her way back to that lifestyle, no matter what it took. A uniformed officer appeared in the doorway. Detective Fuller? There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Fuller frowned. Who? A Mr. Brian Hanson. Says he's Marilyn's ex-husband, and he has information about the case. The room went silent. Deborah's face had gone pale. Brian Hansen is here? She whispered. Why would he come forward now? Fuller looked at her sharply. You know him. I tried to talk to him years ago, when I was investigating Diane's death. He refused to speak to me, threatened to call the police if I contacted him again. Deborah's hands were shaking. He knows something. He's always known something. Fuller stood. Wait here, all of you. He left the room, and we sat in tense silence. Jonathan stared at his hands. Deborah gripped the edge of the table. I tried to process everything I'd learned in the past few hours, but it felt like trying to hold water in my hands. 10 minutes later, Fuller returned with a man in his 50s, well-dressed in an expensive overcoat, his face drawn with stress. Brian Hansen looked like he hadn't slept in days. Mr. Hansen has some information to share, Fuller said. Information that changes the scope of this investigation considerably. Hansen's eyes found Deborah across the table. Mrs. Sullivan, I owe you an apology. I should have come forward years ago, but I was afraid. Of Marilyn, of what she might do, of what she might reveal about me. What do you know about my daughter's death? Deborah demanded. Hansen sat down heavily. I know Marilyn killed her, and I know why. Because Diane wasn't just investigating Thomas's death. She'd found something else. Something Marilyn desperately needed to keep hidden. What? Fuller asked sharply. Hansen looked at me, and there was pity in his eyes. Marilyn didn't just target your family randomly, Mrs. Whitman. She chose Jonathan very deliberately. Because 25 years ago, your husband Gerald handled a real estate transaction for my father's company. A transaction that was technically legal but morally questionable, involving property rights and mineral deposits. That land is now worth millions. My heart stopped. What property? Your property, Hansen said quietly. The farm you've lived on for 40 years. Marilyn found out about the mineral rights buried in the old contracts. Rights that were never properly transferred when your husband bought the land. Rights that, if properly claimed, could make whoever owns your farm extremely wealthy. The room spun. Gerald had been so proud when he'd bought this farm, had insisted he'd gotten a fair price. But he'd never mentioned mineral rights. Marilyn wasn't just after insurance money, Hansen continued. She was after a fortune in natural gas rights underneath your property, and she was willing to kill anyone who stood in her way. The conference room felt smaller with Brian Hansen in it, his revelation hanging in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire. I sat perfectly still, my mind racing through 40 years of memories. Gerald's pride when we'd bought the farm, his careful attention to every detail of the property, his insistence that we'd made a sound investment for our future. Had he known about the mineral rights? Or had he been deceived, too? Explain this from the beginning, Detective Fuller said, his pen poised over his notebook. And I want everything, Mr. Hansen. No more protecting yourself or anyone else. Hansen nodded, his hands clasped tightly on the table. My father's company, Hansen Medical, made most of its money from pharmaceuticals. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he diversified into real estate investments, particularly rural properties in Pennsylvania that might have natural gas deposits. This was before fracking became profitable, before anyone really understood the value of what was underground. And my husband's farm? I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Was one of several properties my father acquired the mineral rights to, then sold the surface rights separately. It was legal. Mineral rights and surface rights can be owned by different parties, but the way he did it was deceptive. He'd buy the entire property, extract the mineral rights through a subsidiary company, then sell the surface rights to unsuspecting buyers at what seemed like a fair price. Hansen's expression was pained. Your husband, Gerald, was one of those buyers. He never knew the mineral rights had been separated. Jonathan's face had gone white. So, Dad bought the farm thinking he owned everything. But he didn't? Technically, he owned the surface, the land, the buildings, everything on top. But Hansen Medical, through a shell company, retained ownership of everything underneath. Hansen looked at me directly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitman. My father wasn't a good man in many ways. When he died 5 years ago, I inherited these holdings. I've been trying to untangle his various schemes ever since. What does this have to do with Marilyn? Deborah asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Marilyn and I were married for 8 years. During that time, she had access to all of my father's business records. She was always interested in money, in finding angles, in discovering assets others had overlooked. Hanson's jaw tightened. After our divorce, she took copies of files she shouldn't have, including the records of these mineral rights holdings. Fuller leaned forward. She knew about the value of Mrs. Whitman's property? She knew that several of the properties my father had done this to were now worth millions because of advances in natural gas extraction. Your farm, Mrs. Whitman, sits on one of the richest deposits in the region. Current estimates value the mineral rights at somewhere between $8 and $12 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. I thought of Marilyn's insistence that I sell, that I move to a retirement community, that I was too old to manage the property. She hadn't been concerned about my welfare. She'd been positioning herself to claim a fortune. But she didn't own the mineral rights, Cooper pointed out. Your company did. Marilyn had a plan for that too, Hanson said bitterly. About 3 years ago, she approached me with a proposal. She said she'd been in contact with several of the surface property owners, including Mrs. Whitman, and that she could convince them to sell their properties cheaply if they thought they were just getting rid of old farms. She proposed that we'd buy the surface rights, consolidate the properties, then sell the entire package, surface and mineral rights together, to an energy company for a massive profit. We'd split everything 50-50. You agreed? Fuller's tone was sharp. No, Hanson said firmly. I told her I was trying to make amends for my father's actions, not compound them. I'd already begun reaching out to property owners to inform them about the mineral rights situation and offer fair compensation. Marilyn was furious. She threatened to expose certain business practices of my father's that could have implicated me in fraud. I should have stood up to her then, but I was afraid. So you stayed silent, Deborah said, her voice cold. Even when my daughter started asking questions about Marilyn, Hanson's face crumpled. Diane came to me about 6 weeks before she died. She'd figured out that Marilyn had been researching your family, Mrs. Whitman, and she'd connected it to the old property deals. Diane was always sharp, always asking questions. She'd been going through Marilyn's things after Thomas died, trying to understand what her friend had been doing, why Marilyn had suddenly become so distant. She found documents, maps, geological surveys. She confronted me. What did you tell her? I asked quietly. I told her to leave it alone. I told her Marilyn was dangerous, that she should focus on grieving her son and let the past stay buried. Hanson's voice broke. I thought I was protecting her. Instead, I signed her death warrant. Deborah made a sound like a wounded animal. Jonathan reached over and gripped her hand. Diane didn't listen. Hanson continued. She called me 2 days before she died and said she was going to the police, that she was going to expose everything. Marilyn's involvement in Thomas's death, the property schemes, all of it. I told her to be careful. The next time I heard about Diane, she was dead. And you still stayed silent, Fuller said, disgust evident in his voice. I was a coward, Hanson admitted. I convinced myself it was suicide, that Diane's grief had simply been too much. But I knew. Deep down, I knew Marilyn had killed her. The door opened, and another officer entered, handing Fuller a sealed evidence bag containing my bottle of vitamins. The detective examined them through the plastic. We'll get these tested, but I'm willing to bet they're contaminated with something, Fuller said. Mr. Hanson, did Marilyn have ongoing access to pharmaceuticals after your divorce? She maintained friendly relations with my father until he died. He thought she was a lovely woman, never knew about the affairs or the manipulations that ended our marriage. She could have gotten anything she wanted from his office or the company warehouses. Hanson looked at me. I should have warned you. When I heard through mutual acquaintances that Marilyn had married Jonathan Whitman, I looked up who you were and realized you owned one of the properties on her list. I should have called you, warned you, but I was still afraid of what she might do to me. What changed? Cooper asked. Why come forward now? Because I've been following the news tonight. My lawyer called me, the same lawyer who's now representing Marilyn. He told me she'd been arrested for Thomas Sullivan's hit and run and for suspicion in Diane's death. He said she was asking him to contact me, to have me provide an alibi for certain dates, to testify to her character. Hansen's expression hardened. That's when I knew I had to stop protecting myself and start doing what was right. I couldn't let her get away with this again. Fuller stood, gathering his notes. Mr. Hansen, I'm going to need you to make a formal statement. Everything you've told us here, plus anything else relevant. And I'm going to need all those files Marilyn took from your father's company. I brought copies with me, Hansen said, pulling a USB drive from his pocket. Everything I have on the mineral rights scheme, Marilyn's communications with me, my father's original documents, it's all there. Deborah was trembling beside me, years of grief and anger finally finding an outlet. She killed my grandson to hide a scheme that made her millions, then killed my daughter to prevent exposure, all while planning to kill Ruth for even more money. How could anyone be that monstrous? Greed, I said softly, and desperation. Marilyn grew up poor, tasted wealth, lost it, and spent the rest of her life trying to get it back. She couldn't accept that she'd have to work honestly for what she wanted. There's one more thing, Hansen said hesitantly. Something that might help you, Mrs. Whitman. When I began my review of my father's holdings, I consulted with several lawyers about the mineral rights situation. The consensus was that the way my father separated the rights was legally questionable. Several of the contracts contain clauses that could be challenged in court. You might have a legitimate claim to those mineral rights. I don't want them, I said immediately. The thought of profiting from Gerald's unknowing participation in this scheme made me sick. If they're worth what you say, I want them sold and the money distributed to the people my husband's transaction harmed. And I want a significant portion to go to Deborah, to establish a foundation in Thomas's and Diane's names. Deborah's eyes filled with tears. Ruth, you don't have to. Yes, I do, I said firmly. My family was used as a tool in Marilyn's schemes. My son married a murderer who was targeting me for death. The least I can do is ensure some good comes from this horror. Fuller's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted. Marilyn's lawyer is requesting a meeting. He says his client wants to make a deal. What kind of deal? Jonathan asked sharply. Hendricks says Marilyn is willing to provide testimony about other crimes, fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, in exchange for a reduced sentence on the murder charges. Fuller's tone was neutral, but I could see the disgust in his eyes. Apparently, she's kept detailed records of various illegal activities over the years, including some involving prominent people. She's willing to turn over everything if the prosecution agrees to certain terms. No, Deborah said flatly. No deals. She murdered my daughter and grandson. She tried to murder Ruth. She doesn't get to negotiate her way out of this. That's not our decision, Fuller said gently. The district attorney will make the call, but your victim impact statements will carry weight. Then let me give mine now, Deborah said, standing up with fierce determination. Let me tell them exactly what Marilyn took from me, from my family. Let me make sure they understand that no amount of information she provides could ever balance the scales of justice for what she's done. Fuller nodded. I'll arrange it. But first, I think we should all confront Marilyn together. Let her see that her schemes have been fully exposed, that all her careful planning has unraveled. Sometimes the best justice is watching a manipulator realize they've lost control. He looked at me. Mrs. Whitman, I know this has been an exhausting and traumatic night, but I think you deserve to face the woman who was planning to kill you. If you're willing, we can arrange a confrontation in the interview room. All of you together. You, Jonathan, Deborah, Mr. Hansen. Let Marilyn see what her greed has destroyed. I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted nothing more than to go home, to retreat to my farmhouse, and try to process everything that had happened. But another part, the part that had survived 68 years of life's challenges, that had buried a beloved husband and rebuilt a life afterward, that had maintained dignity and kindness in the face of Marilyn's subtle cruelties for over a decade, that part wanted to look my would-be killer in the eye. Yes, I said quietly. I'll do it. But not for revenge. I want Marilyn to understand what she's lost. Not the money or the property or the schemes. I want her to see the human cost of her choices. I want her to face the people she's hurt and acknowledge what she's done. Fuller smiled grimly. Then let's go have a conversation with Marilyn Whitman. As we filed out of the conference room toward the interview rooms where Marilyn waited with her expensive lawyer, I realized that this Christmas Eve had become something I'd never anticipated. Not a quiet family celebration, but a reckoning. A moment when truth confronted lies, when justice faced down manipulation, when the accumulated weight of Marilyn's crimes finally caught up with her carefully constructed facade. And I was ready to be part of that reckoning, not with anger or hatred, but with the quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of choosing kindness over cruelty, truth over deception, and integrity over expedience. Deborah walked beside me, her hand finding mine. Two women in their 60s, both survivors, both stronger than the forces that had tried to break them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for inviting me in tonight, for being exactly who you are." "Thank you," I replied, "for saving my life." Behind us, Jonathan and Brian Hansen followed, two men who'd been used and manipulated by the same woman, now united in ensuring she faced the consequences of her actions. Detective Fuller led us down a hallway toward interview room 3, where Marilyn waited. It was time for the truth to speak louder than any lie. The interview room was smaller than I'd expected, with cinder block walls painted an institutional beige and a mirror that I knew was one-way glass. Marilyn sat at a metal table, her lawyer Marcus Hendricks beside her in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She'd regained some of her composure, her spine straight, her expression carefully neutral. But when the door opened and she saw all of us, me, Jonathan, Deborah, Brian Hansen, and Detective Fuller, her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fear underneath. "What is this?" Hendricks demanded, half rising from his chair. "Detective Fuller, my client agreed to a private consultation, not a group confrontation. Your client is welcome to leave at any time," Fuller said calmly, gesturing for us to take seats along the wall. "But she requested this meeting, said she wanted to explain herself to her family. Well, here's her family, and the families she's destroyed." Marilyn's eyes darted from face to face, and I could see her mind working, calculating angles, searching for leverage. It was a look I'd seen before, but never understood until tonight. The look of someone who viewed every interaction as a transaction, every relationship as an opportunity for exploitation. "Jonathan," she said, her voice taking on that soft, vulnerable tone she'd perfected over 12 years of marriage. "Please, you have to understand. Everything I did for us, for our family." "Stop," Jonathan said quietly. The single word carried more weight than a shout. "Just stop, Marilyn. I've been sitting in another room for 2 hours listening to recordings of your confession, reviewing evidence of your crimes, learning that you forged my signature on documents that could have destroyed me financially. Don't insult me by pretending any of this was for our family." Marilyn's face hardened. "You never understood what it took to maintain the lifestyle you enjoyed. The schools, the vacations, the nice house. Where did you think that money came from?" "I thought it came from our combined salaries and careful budgeting," Jonathan said. "Not from murdering people and stealing their insurance money. Not from planning to kill my mother for her property." "I wasn't going to kill her," Marilyn said quickly, turning to me. "Ruth, you have to believe me. I was researching methods, yes, but I never would have gone through with it. I'm not a monster." "You killed an 8-year-old boy and drove away," Deborah said, her voice like ice. "You murdered my daughter to cover it up. You were researching how to kill Ruth without raising suspicion. What exactly would you call yourself if not a monster?" Marilyn's lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "Thomas's death was an accident. I panicked, yes, but I didn't mean to hurt him. And Diane was going to destroy everything. She was hysterical, irrational, threatening to go to the police with theories and accusations that would have ruined my life over an accident." "So you killed her," I said quietly. "You gave her pills until she stopped being a problem." "I helped her find peace." Marilyn's voice rose. "She was suffering, drowning in grief over Thomas. She could barely function. The pills were a mercy." "Mercy?" Deborah stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "You murdered my daughter and you dare call it mercy?" She was 34 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. And you took it because she was inconvenient, because she was getting close to the truth about what you'd done. Mrs. Sullivan, please sit down, Hendricks said, his professional composure cracking slightly. This isn't productive. But Deborah wasn't finished. She pulled a photograph from her purse and slapped it on the table in front of Marilyn. That's Thomas on his 8th birthday, 3 weeks before you killed him. Look at him. Look at what you took from this world. Marilyn glanced at the photo and quickly looked away, but not before I saw something flicker in her expression. Guilt? Regret? Or just frustration that her carefully laid plans had unraveled? And this, Deborah continued, producing another photo, is Diane at Thomas's funeral. See her face? That's what grief looks like, Marilyn. Real grief. Not the crocodile tears you've been crying tonight. You saw her like this and you decided she was too much trouble to keep alive. I tried to help her, Marilyn whispered, but the conviction was gone from her voice. Brian Hansen spoke for the first time since entering the room. No, you tried to use her. Just like you used me, used Jonathan, used Ruth. Everyone in your life is just a tool to get what you want. Marilyn's eyes flashed with anger when she saw her ex-husband. You have no right to judge me, Brian. You and your father built your wealth on schemes and deceptions. I learned everything from watching your family. My father was a greedy, unethical man, Hansen acknowledged, but he never killed anyone. He never looked someone in the eye while planning their death. You took what you learned from him and made it infinitely worse. Detective Fuller set a folder on the table. Marilyn, your lawyer says you want to make a deal, that you have information about other crimes that might interest the district attorney. Before we go down that road, I want everyone in this room to hear what you're offering and what you're asking for in return. Hendricks cleared his throat. My client has maintained detailed records of various financial crimes involving prominent individuals in Philadelphia and surrounding areas. Fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, tax evasion. She's willing to provide testimony and documentation in exchange for reduced charges on the manslaughter counts and immunity on the insurance fraud. Manslaughter? Deborah's voice shook with fury. She premeditated both murders. That's first-degree murder, not manslaughter. The evidence for premeditation on Diane Sullivan's death is circumstantial, Hendricks argued, and Thomas Sullivan's death was genuinely an accident, however tragic. My client panicked and made poor choices in the aftermath, but the initial incident was not intentional. She researched methods to kill Ruth for weeks, Jonathan said, his voice hard. How is that not premeditation? Research isn't action, Hendricks countered. Mrs. Whitman is alive and unharmed. At most, that's conspiracy or attempted murder, and even those charges would be difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. I watched Marilyn during this exchange. She sat very still, letting her lawyer do the talking, but her eyes were active, assessing, calculating. She was already planning her next move, her next manipulation. What information do you have? Fuller asked. And who does it implicate? Marilyn leaned forward slightly, and I saw the predator emerge. I have records of kickback schemes involving state contracts worth millions. I have evidence of several prominent attorneys and judges accepting bribes. I have documentation of a pharmaceutical distribution network that was knowingly selling contaminated medications. And I have proof that my ex-father-in-law's mineral rights scheme involved over 50 properties and defrauded landowners out of a collective $40 million. The room went silent. Even Hendricks looked surprised by the scope of what Marilyn was offering. That's quite a list, Fuller said carefully. But before the DA considers any deal, I need to know. Why? Why keep all these records? Why maintain this documentation if you were involved in these schemes yourself? Marilyn smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. Insurance detective, I learned a long time ago that information is power. Every scheme I was part of, every crime I witnessed, I documented. Not because I'm a good citizen, but because I knew that someday I might need leverage. Looks like today is that day. You're a parasite, Deborah said quietly. You feed on people's trust and goodness, document their weaknesses, and use everything for your own benefit. You don't have a single genuine relationship in your life, do you? Not one person who matters to you beyond what they can provide. Marilyn's eyes found mine. That's not true. I did care about Jonathan, about the children. I wanted to build a good life for them. On top of corpses and lies, I said. Marilyn, do you even understand what you've done? The lives you've destroyed? The pain you've caused? Or is it all just numbers in a ledger to you? For a moment, just a brief, flickering moment, I saw something in Marilyn's eyes that might have been genuine emotion. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of the enormity of her crimes. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that seemed to be her default state. I understand that I made choices I can't take back, she said carefully. I understand that people were hurt, but I also understand that I have valuable information that can bring down people far worse than me. People who've stolen millions, who've corrupted the justice system, who've harmed thousands. Isn't that worth something? It's worth considering, Fuller said. But it doesn't erase what you've done. It doesn't bring Thomas or Diane back. It doesn't undo the trauma you've caused Ruth and Jonathan and your children. I know that, Marilyn said, and for the first time her voice cracked slightly. I know I can't fix what I've broken, but maybe I can prevent other people from being hurt by exposing these crimes. Maybe that counts for something. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after hours of sitting. Marilyn looked up at me, and I saw uncertainty in her expression for the first time. You want to know if it counts for something? I asked quietly. It counts for the fact that you're finally telling the truth about something. It counts for the possibility that some good might come from the wreckage you've created. But it doesn't change what you are, Marilyn. It doesn't change that you looked at my family as a target, that you married my son as part of a scheme, that you planned my death while sitting at my dinner table and smiling at me. I moved closer to the table, close enough to see the fine lines around Marilyn's eyes, the smudged mascara, the tremor in her hands she was trying to hide. I invited a stranger into my home on Christmas Eve because I believe in kindness, I continued. I believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt, in seeing the best in others. You've spent almost 10 years in my family, and you never once understood that simple truth. You saw kindness as weakness, trust as opportunity, love as something to exploit. Ruth, Marilyn started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. That stranger I invited in, Deborah, she used my kindness to expose you. And you know what? I'm grateful. Because she understood something you never did. That kindness paired with wisdom is stronger than cruelty paired with cunning. That patience and preparation can defeat manipulation and greed. That in the end, the truth will find its way to light, no matter how many lies you pile on top of it. I turned to Detective Fuller. Whatever deal the district attorney works out with Marilyn, I want one condition: that she allocates a portion of any assets recovered from her schemes to establish a foundation in Thomas and Diane Sullivan's names. A foundation that helps families who've lost children to hit-and-run accidents, that supports grief counseling, that works to solve cold cases. Let some good come from this darkness. Fuller nodded. I'll make sure that request reaches the DA. I looked at Deborah, who had tears streaming down her face. And I want you to know that my property, whatever mineral rights I might have claimed to, I'm signing them over to that foundation. Gerald would have wanted it that way. He was a good man who was deceived, and I won't profit from that deception. Ruth, you don't have to do that, Deborah protested. Yes, I do, I said firmly. Because that's who I am. That's who my husband raised me to be. And Marilyn will never understand it. But that's what makes me richer than she'll ever be, no matter how many schemes she runs or how much money she steals. I turned to Jonathan, who was crying silently. Come on, son. Let's go home. Let's go back to that farmhouse where your father and I raised you with love and honesty. Let's remember what really matters. Jonathan stood, and together we walked toward the door. Deborah followed, and Brian Hansen after her. We left Marilyn sitting at that metal table with her expensive lawyer, surrounded by evidence of her crimes, faced with the consequences of a lifetime of choosing wrong over right. At the door, I paused and looked back one last time. I forgive you, Marilyn, I said quietly. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred would make me more like you, and I refuse to let your poison touch who I am. I forgive you, and I hope that someday, In whatever time you spend paying for your crimes, you learn to forgive yourself and understand the value of a single honest, kind act. Then I walked out into the cold December night, my son's arm around my shoulders, Deborah beside me, the first hints of dawn touching the eastern sky. The farmhouse was exactly as we'd left it, the Christmas dinner still on the table, the lights still twinkling on the tree. It looked like a photograph of a life interrupted, a moment frozen in time before everything changed. Emma and Lucas were asleep on the couch, Fuller's wife reading quietly in Gerald's old chair. She stood when we entered, relief flooding her face. "I've got them," I said softly, looking at my grandchildren. "Thank you for watching over them." After she left, the four of us sat in my living room as the sun rose on Christmas morning. We talked until we had no more words, cried until we had no more tears, and slowly began the process of healing. In the days that followed, Marilyn agreed to a deal: 25 years for Diane's murder, 10 years for the hit and run, various fraud charges, all to be served consecutively. In exchange, she provided evidence that led to 17 arrests and helped recover over $30 million in stolen assets. The foundation was established. The mineral rights were transferred. My farmhouse remained my home, but it became something more, a symbol that wisdom, patience, and kindness could triumph over greed and cruelty. Deborah became a regular visitor, a friend forged in shared trauma and mutual respect. We worked together on the foundation, turning tragedy into purpose, grief into action. Jonathan rebuilt his life slowly, focusing on his children and his work, learning to trust again. And I continued to answer my door when strangers knocked, to invite people in from the cold, to believe in the fundamental goodness that persists even in a world that sometimes seems designed to punish it. Because in the end, that's what Marilyn never understood, that the true measure of wealth isn't counted in dollars or property or schemes successfully executed. It's counted in lives touched with kindness, in integrity maintained under pressure, in the strength to choose right when wrong would be easier. And by that measure, I remain the richest woman I know. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.